of this stuff. So one analogy that I've heard recently was the difference between a chef and a cook, right? If you're a cook, you're just going to learn recipes. And if you're a chef, you're going to be learning, the technique. You're going to be learning flavor combinations. So rather than just following along with something, you can apply this to what you're doing later on. So that's really what I want you guys to get out of going over this. So I'm just going to open up this first experiment here. And the first experiment, so this gives you a representation of what it is that we're creating, what we're going for. And the first experiment is setting up this object, right? So setting up a complex game object in Unity, creating an object from multiple primitives. So this is something you'll definitely be doing a lot of, setting up these more intricate systems and more interactable objects with these pieces need to rotate, these pieces need to stay stationary, and understanding that hierarchy. So that's what we're going to be doing in the first experiment. So let's go ahead and jump in there. I've got my Unity project open already, and I'm inside of the IND2 wind turbine scene for now. And then we can add in the hub scene when we want to test it out with the character. So the first thing we want to do is create the pieces that we're going to need for our wind turbine. So I'm going to go ahead and create some game objects. Let's start with a sphere. I'm going to call this object pivot. All right, and let's put this at the origin to start. So just zero all this out. Let's start at the origin. And this is a really good habit to get into when you're setting up, these complex game objects that have a lot of pieces that you're attaching to each other and rearranging the hierarchy. It's good to just start at the origin and then move it around once you've finalized it how you want it to be. All right, so there's our pivot. That's going to be an object that's actually going to rotate. Now let's create the blades for the wind turbine. So let's go ahead and create a capsule. All right, and let's just change the scale of this. Let's give this a value of 3 in the Y and 0.25 in the Z. All right, and let's name it blade. All right, now let's go ahead and duplicate this twice. So duplicate it twice. And now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to drag all of these into the pivot object, right? So now with my pivot object selected, I can move this around and everything should move with it. All right, that's creating that parent-child relationship. So now anything I do to the pivot object, the blades are going to also do at the same time. So let's go ahead and get our blades into the position that we actually want them in. So we can rotate them, one of them 60 degrees in the Z and the other negative 60. Now you'll see we have this cool flower looking shape. But this isn't exactly what we want from here. So you'll notice that when I go to the move tool, that the widget is already moving in the direction of my game object. If yours doesn't look like this, that's because of this pivot button up here, this local and pivot up here. So you'll know that the pivot isn't going to change anything now because this toggles between the pivot and the center of the object. We talked a little bit about this when we went over the level blocking meshes, right? The level blocking meshes pivot from the corner, right? So we'll cover that again later. But here, this local and global space. You'll notice when I turn it to global space, it now matches the same axes as it does in the world, right? It's global, the entire world. Local is just that game object. So it knows that the up vector of this object is pointing this way, right? So it's staying with that object. If I select different objects, you'll notice it's different for each one. So this is a really handy tool to use to be able to bounce back and forth between local and global what you're doing, because now we can very easily move these in place much nicer with the local position rather than if I were to take this in global, now I move it down in the Y, then over in the X. Now I'm just finagling it in place. It's much easier to just slide it on one axis. I'm going to go ahead and get these in place. I like whole numbers, so let's get these as close as we can. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, so now the next thing we want to do is just test it. Good thing to always just get in the habit of testing this as often as you can, just to make sure nothing's breaking, especially when you're setting up a game object like this. And this one is fairly simple, but you will see some examples and some other setups that have multiple pieces, a lot of stuff going on in the hierarchy. And now you'll notice when I select my pivot object, my pivot isn't in the spot I want it, right? So now I rotate it and it's rotating from weird position. That's because we have this center selected, right? So if I go to pivot, it's going to go to the actual pivot of that game object. Center is just find the middle point between all these game objects. So all three blades in the pivot. So go to pivot there and rotate and just grab the Z-axis and everything's moving accordingly how we want it to. Looking good. All right, so the next thing we want to do is just create the base for this to sit on, right? We're going to create some type of stand for our wind turbine. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a cube. Just scale this up just a bit. And now this is really the part where it becomes creative. It's totally up to you how you want to do this. There's no right solution. I'm just building some type of structure for this. Zero that out. All right, and let's call this head. All right, now I'm going to create a cylinder. Scale this guy up. And just position that like so. Create some type of base for our wind turbine to sit on. All right. So I'm going to call this stalk. All right, and now same thing. We want to parent these to each other to have it one large game object to move around. So we have our head and our stalk. So I'm going to drag the head into the stalk. So now that should move around as one piece. All right. So now we have our stalk object and we have our pivot. Two separate game objects. And we want to combine these into one, right? We'll have this build up our chain of our hierarchy. So from here, we want to create an empty game object. So what's really nice about Unity is I can go ahead and just create an empty, and it'll put it in some place like that. But what I can do is if I select the object I want and do right-click create empty, it will create it inside that object, but you also notice it's creating it in the same location. So I can very easily just pull it out of here now. Not inside level geo, just outside there, right? And it's at that 0, 0, 0 position. That's what we want. We want it to be at a clean transform and rotation before we drop them in our level. So I'm just going to rename this wind turbine. This is going to be what holds everything. And one little trick I actually just learned about, it's really useful, especially when you're getting used to Unity and using empty game objects. If you go over here in this little cube icon over here and select an icon, you can choose anything you want, really up to you. I'm going to go with, let's go with pink, why not? I'll do a pink dot. So now you'll see that pink dot in Unity, right? It's a way to display your empty game object. So what you want to do now is take your pivot and your stalk, right? I can control select to grab both of them and drag and drop them inside the wind turbine. All right, so now you've got everything in one game object. Everything's still at 0, 0, 0. You'll notice that, right? And now I can move my whole game object around and everything will move with it. One thing to notice too is if I move, say I move this stalk, I move it up in place, right? I move it somewhere where it shouldn't be, where I don't want it. I go to my wind turbine, this hasn't moved. It's in the same location. So you can move children around all day and the parents aren't going to get affected. But when you go to move the parent, the children goes along with it. So that being said, we want to now get our wind turbine in a nice and useful position. So if I were to duplicate this and say I want to put this wind turbine on the ground, it makes it real tough to actually place this where I want to because where the pivot is located. So rather than going into Maya with a game object or with a mesh and moving your pivot, you can start to move the children and keep that wind turbine, that empty game object, in the same location. So I'm going to grab the pivot and the stalk. Now I'm just going to move them up. And I'm going to move these right to where that base is on that floor. So now you'll see if I go and select my pivot, my wind turbine, that game object hasn't moved, right? Still at 0, 0, 0, still at the base, but now it makes it much easier for me to go ahead and place this where I want to, right? I can place this and drop it in, and it'll stay at the base there. So that's setting up a complex game object. And then from here, what you want to do is definitely, again, test it. Make sure you rotate your pivot object. Make sure nothing's breaking or other pieces aren't rotating with it. Sometimes you'll have some weird scale issues. But that's it. That's setting up a complex object. And really understanding this hierarchy and how things work within it will definitely help you be successful. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and save. Definitely get in the habit too of coming back to Perforce and checking in your work. So far, all we've done is modified the scene, right? We don't have anything changed but just this IND2 wind turbine scene. And it's important to just continue to remember what it is you're changing. I'll never forget, I was working with a student and I was like, all right, I got this functionality and I want to make my door, open up when a certain thing happens. I was like, all right, let's go to your script and take a look at what you're working on. And then he goes, well, how do I know I wrote that script? I'm like, what? Did you write it or not? And he just didn't know. He was doing so much in Unity, right? You're modifying your scene, you're adding stuff. He didn't know if he wrote it or not. So you have to be conscious of what it is you're working on. And there we only changed the scene. So I can very easily come to Perforce now in my assets folder, right? Just the scenes. I can select this folder, right? Because the where is it? Wind turbine is inside there. So I can just go ahead and reconcile this scene and it'll reconcile this folder, right? Because this has my change in it. And I can go ahead and reconcile. And you'll notice that came up really, really quickly. If I go up the chain, like I go to assets and reconcile offline work, it takes a little bit longer, right? It's scanning through every single asset. And it's not a big deal now. When you're working in a smaller project, but when you start to work with a team or even a big title, when you get out in the industry, you don't want to be scanning through the whole project. You really want to be only utilizing what it is you're changing and being able to quickly make changes and get back to work, right? So just go ahead, reconcile, found the changes. And then just put a small description, right? Definitely don't just leave it something simple. But that was it, right? That was only a minute or two, and now my work is saved and backed up on Perforce. So I know that I was, hinting and strongly encouraging you utilize that while you're doing your visuals and setting. But if you didn't do so, it's okay. But definitely take the time this month and during this assignment and the entryway to get used to submitting changes to a Unity project. Because it's one thing just to upload a shortcut or upload an exe, right? Just mark for add and submit. But actually getting your hands dirty and making changes to a Unity project and getting Perforce to communicate is definitely the next step. So now we're going to get into setting up the actual animations, right? Because now we have this object, we want to animate it and have it play these animations during certain times during the game. So let's open up. Number 2. Alrighty, so the first thing that we want to understand is how do we set up the animation, right? What is the thing we need to do to actually put animations on this object? So if you go to the window animation window, this is where you actually create your animation clips. So you'll notice the animation here and the animator. We're going to be using both of these, but it's definitely good to understand that in the animation window, this is where you actually create the clips for what it is you want, you want to have motion, right? So if you open up this window with nothing selected, you'll get this error, or you'll get this message here: no animatable object selected. Unity is really nice because it will tell you exactly what you need to select in order to function. Definitely with this window and the animator, they both do a really good job at that. So obviously now you'll select the object that you want to animate. So what object is it that we want to animate here? Yep, the pivot, right? It was the animation window is window animation. It's also Control 6 is a shortcut, but window animation. All right, so you select the blades, or select the pivot, sorry, and you'll have the blades in there. All right, and now it'll say to begin animating pivot, create an animator and an animation clip. All right, so we're going to need both of those. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And now what I'm going to do is I have this wind turbine experiment folder. I would definitely recommend creating something as well. I think I have animations in here. So let me just go ahead and I'll just name these something else. I'll do like idle May, since it's the month of May. But definitely create a folder in here. And just you're going to put animation clips. You can put your sound effects, materials when you get to your actual entryway. But this is a really great way to stay organized now, right? Because if I just save everything to this wind turbine experiments folder, I can very easily go over to Perforce and reconcile or mark them for add, and makes the process much easier and much less painful. So now we have this this clip here, right? And so now we have this clip selected. So now what you can do is you have to add a property, right? Because Unity wants to know what is it that you want to animate, right? So if I go ahead and hit add property, you'll see that I have access to everything, all the components of this object. So the transform, which this is what holds the position and the rotation. Most commonly what you're going to be animating is the transform component. You can animate a collider. You can animate the renderer to turn on and off. You could animate the animator. I know that's a whole nother level of inception. But another key thing that we're not going to use now, but this is really important to understand for when you build your entryway, is look at what else we have access to. We have access to these blade objects, right? So we can actually animate the children objects inside of here. So I can open these up and actually animate them separately. So this could be really useful, for example, so for a basic door, right? Very simple basic door that just opens up on a hinge. You could parent your handle in such a way to where one animation, the handle rotates down and then the door swings open, right? It can all be done in one animation. Rather than having separate animation clips, separate animators for every little movement and every little piece, you can have it all right here in one animation. So it can be a lot to set up and a lot to look at, but it's really nice to have it all in one place. And I'll show you an example of mine after we go through the experiments. Question?
Do we have to use measurement for the entryway, or can we use script?
We're going to write a script, but I definitely recommend using mechanim for sure. Because really what's going to happen is we're going to talk to mechanim through script to basically just turn on and off a parameter. The old way that Unity used to play animations was a lot more time consuming, and you did have to write a pretty lengthy script. Now we can just change a Boolean and our animations are going to play just how we want them to. And it's really like since I think Unity, I want to say Unity 4.5 or even Unity 5.0, it's like mechanim is like the way to go. You used to be able to like add an animation component to something. You would add an animation component like this and then put in your clip here, and they don't want people using this anymore. They're really trying to get away from this. It's really becoming deprecated. So for now, just learn this and understand it, and then later in your own project, you can utilize anything you want. So now I'm just going to go ahead and add a property, right? So we're going to add the rotation of our pivot object. And now you'll notice that these two diamonds, or keyframes is what they're called, they come into our timeline, right? So a little bit about the animation window itself. You're going to notice this record button. Anytime that this is on, any changes you make in the scene, those are being recorded. So you can't necessarily just undo like you normally would. So you can come to a certain time, adjust your animation, or adjust how it looks, and those keys are going to be added. So be careful when that record is on, and definitely always make sure to play here, and you'll see that this go through the timeline to make sure your animation is how it looks. Unity also does a really good job of turning these buttons red up here to let you know, hey, you're recording right now. You can't just jump in and play. Be careful what you're doing. Also about this window, you'll see up here this timeline, right? That's what this is referred to. And this red bar shows you where you are in the timeline. So a very common rule of thumb, or a very common word used with animators and artists, is scrubbing through the timeline, right? So that's just taking your timeline here. Whoops. It's just taking your timeline here and dragging through to see the motion happen, right? So you can click up here in your timeline anywhere you want, and this will jump to basically where the current time is. All right, also down here is the dope sheet and the curves. So right now your dope sheet will just show you keyframes and your space over time, right? Your curves is actually going to show you what your animation looks like as a graph. So surprise everybody, animation is pretty much just reading graphs. And I think that's probably why I enjoy it so much, is I really like math and I have that technical mindset. So really, you guys know what slope is? Know what the slope of a line, right? So the closer your slope is to 0, right? When your slope is 0, it's a flat line. That's no change or no motion, right? But if you have a very gradual change or a slope it's even, right? That's an even and consistent motion. So the more and more you do this, you'll start to be able to understand what's happening in your animation based on what's going on in the curves. So we've got our idle animation, all right? We've just added our keyframes. We don't want any motion. We are now officially animators. So now what we can do is let's create our spinning animation for when this object is on, right? So that's our idle is basically our off state, and let's create the spinning. I'm just going to name this May. All right, now same thing. We want to come in here and add our property, add the rotation. So now here at 0, we're going to leave this a value of, set this to 0. Now drag this over here and set this to 360. So definitely test this, make sure it looks how you want it. And by default, it's just going to loop for us here in the animation. All right, let's just go back to our idle. So you can very quickly toggle between your two or however many clips you have right here. So let's go to idle and check. All right, that looks pretty good. So now if I go to my spinning animation and take a look at the curves, there's our Z graph, right? That's what it looks like in the Z, constant change. So really how to read the graph is, right, time on one axis and then either, distance or rotation on the other. So let me see if I can find a good on this, because I know that this isn't like what you're going to school for, but the more you understand this, the better your work is going to be. It's just the better polish you're going to be able to add to this. So up here, this image here, oh, and it's even animated. Awesome. So this will basically show you, if these were your keyframes and how they're spaced out over time, how this object's going to behave. So if you have even keyframes with an even change, it's a very even, constant motion, right? This is what would be representative of this graph right here, right? Just a straight line, constantly moving, but at the same rate. Now here, you'll see that they're slow. They're farther apart here and closer together, right? So the farther apart your keyframes are, the faster the object's going to be moving, or the larger amount of space that the object's going to be covering in a shorter amount of time is going to discern how fast the object moves. And now here they start really close together, so it's slower. Now they're farther apart and then closer together again. So really starting to and you can just, I just looked up basic animation spacing. You can get a lot of this. This graph does the same thing, right? This is very even. This is slow and then gets faster. This is fast and then gets slower. So you'll see a lot more of this come up as you continue to work on your assignments. So also you have a little bit of control of the tangents, right? Because your tangent is the slope, and that's what controls the animation. So if you right-click on one of your keyframes and do something like set it to flat, flat is going to set it to 0. So now you'll see this little handle here that you can control and manipulate how the curve is getting to that point, how it's flowing in. And this is where you can set it to, slow in or slow out or behave how you want it. So right now this isn't going to be exactly what we want, but I just want to show you what can happen when I, change my curves like that. So this isn't going to loop properly. It's going to look a little strange, but you'll notice that it takes a second to start and then it slowly comes to a stop, right? And that's all just manipulating these curves. And I should be able to do this in real time. So there you'll see it starts out really slow and then gets a lot faster. Because you can see my basically look at the slopes as it progresses, right? It's really flat, gets a lot sharper, gets a lot sharper, gets a lot sharper.
So that's how, so then you can make it like, pretend like it's starting up and then it goes faster.
Exactly, yeah. You can give a lot more behavior and a lot more control of it.
Can you extend how many keyframes there are in the animation?
Yeah, so can you extend how many keyframes you are? Definitely. So let me set this back to how we want it. So the best way to do that I like to grab is go to the dope sheet, because by default you're just going to go 0 to 1 or 0 to 1 second. Every Unity will just default it to make it 1 second. You can grab this last keyframe and just drag it out to where you want. So say I want it a minute and a third, or a second and a third. These aren't minutes; these are seconds.
So what's the max limit of like where it goes to?
You can keep going forever. So if you hold Alt and then use your mouse wheel, you can scroll the timeline to keep going. And then I can just drag this. So I want my animation to be 3 seconds. Drag it to there. And then you'll also see that this bar should update. Let me see if I play. Oh, there we go. See there, now it updated. So this is that lighter gray color. So now it's the same animation, but right, spread out a longer amount of time. What do you think is going to be different about this? It's going to spin slower, right? Same motion, but it's spinning a lot slower. All right. Up here too, I'm gonna mention this a little bit, and then I'm gonna kind of cover it next week a little bit more. But up here, you have these two buttons, right? So add a keyframe. That's pretty straightforward. You can just go to somewhere in your timeline and add keyframe, and it'll pop in like that. The other one you get to really use, and this is definitely something that's super useful in a lot of different ways, is this one right here, which is an add an event. So I can add an animation event, and pretty much what this can do is, so say at 1 second in my animation here, I want a light to turn on, or I want something else to happen. I want to communicate with the game halfway through this animation. Well, I can add an animation event. And what that does is this pops up this little tick here, right? So if I open this up, you get this edit animation event, and now I can select a function to go off at this time. And how you set this up is you just have a script on this same game object that will do what it is that you want to do. So I can show you an example of this at the end. We get
the game object being animated, you put that script?
Yep, you put the script with however many functions you want on there, and then you have them selected from a drop down. So then during this animation, at this point, that function will happen. So this is also really great for playing sounds. So we're going to show you how to play sounds just through the script we're going to write itself. But this is another really great way to say when you have, you have your door open animation. At the beginning, you want to have a creaking effect, and then at the end, you want some other sound effect, right? So you want them to happen at certain times. Animation events is a great way to do it. Same thing with like particle effects or just communicating to the player in certain ways. Animation events are really powerful. All right, so now we have our two separate clips, right? We have our spinning and our idle. So I'm going to go ahead and close the animation window for now.
And those are just saved, right? You don't have to like save them again or anything.
Nope, yep, they're saved in there. So if we look in our wind turbine experiment folder, you're going to notice, so here is this controllers, right? So when you create your clips, remember if we go to the window animation and we select the other object, it's going to say create an animator and an animation clip. So the animator here, this holds all the information of how one state gets to the next, what are the parameters, what are the conditions that we need to set to transition from one state to the next. That's what holds all that information. Bless you. And that's what we're about to set up. Now the clips, these are what holds the actual motion. Those are what we just created, right? So we created this spinning May and this idle May. So I'm going to go ahead and select my object, select my pivot, and go to Window Animator. All right. So by default, it's already given me, it's already created those two states for me. Unity was nice enough to create a state. Let me see if I can make this. Bam, full screen. All right, so you'll see that it creates a state for every clip we already created, right? So we have this idle and we have this spinning. And here is this entry state. This is totally normal, and I think somewhere around here there's probably, there it is, the exit way over there, hanging out by himself. So the entry, this is basically if you have something spawn in or if you have something instantiate. When this object enters the world and is active, this is the state that it's going to start in. That's all this entry is stating. So if this is broken for whatever reason, you can do set state machine default state and now set it to here. So now default when this thing turns on or the game runs, is going to start in the spinning state. So we're going to go ahead and just make this one, make the idle the default. All right, and now what we want to do is set up a transition to get from one state to the next. So we can go ahead and make a transition. Now you have this little arrow that'll drag around, and now we want to, you'll see it'll snap to the other states. So snap it to the spinning. So now we have a transition, right, from the idle to spinning. And now you'll see you just right-click on the state itself and make transition. You'll also notice too that if you want to like delete this, if you make a mistake, you don't really have the option to. So you have to hit function delete on your keyboard to delete a transition. So a little workaround, but that's how you get that done. So here in the state itself, right, you'll see that this is where your clip or your motion is plugged in. So if this ever breaks, right, like there's no motion in there, you can go ahead and just drop in your state. Or say you create a new state, and now there's no motion in there. You got to make sure there's a animation clip associated with the state itself. All right, so now we have it going from idle to spinning, right? And now we also want to set up, having it transition back from spinning to idle. So now it should be going through this loop. So let's go ahead and save and play and see what happens. So it's off. And then it turns on. So right now, if I go to my animator, you'll see it's just looping through. So it's playing my spinning, it's going back to idle, playing idle once, going back, and it's just going back and forth ping-ponging, right? Now we want to control it. When is it on? When is it off? So how we can do that is what we can do is add a parameter. So here in the parameters, if you hit this little plus, you'll see the options that you have. You can have a float, an integer, a bool, and a trigger. You guys should all be familiar with the difference between a float and an integer. Everybody know the difference, right? Float is a decimal, integer is a whole number. And a Boolean, right, that's just 1 or 0, true or false, on or off. And a trigger is something a little bit different. This is for Unity. And this is something like the animation events, definitely useful to know and very, very useful. But what we're gonna use for this scenario is a Boolean. But a trigger is basically just basically something you can hit and trigger. So basically just tell Unity, trigger this thing, and then that will send that command to go somewhere else, or tell it to go to a different state. So now I'm gonna add a Boolean. All right, and I'm gonna call this is spinning. It's not going. Do you have both of your transitions?
Yeah. Because it's the same exact thing as yours. Oh wait, maybe there's like a little down arrow on the bottom of it.
Oh, you may have another transition that's not going anywhere. All right, so now you can see if I select the transition itself, I click on the actual arrow, and this will open up the. Oh geez. Unity's getting a little crazy. So you'll see here in the, and when I select the transition itself, I have a lot of this information. I can have an exit time on here, and here's the conditions. So what is the parameter? What is the condition that's going to allow me to get from one state to the next? So if I go ahead and hit this plus, it will already fill in something for me, right? It found that test trigger that I just created. But I want to use the is spinning. All right, so now it'll say basically is spinning is set to true. That's how it's going to transition from idle to spinning, right? Is when when is spinning is set to true. Now if I go over here and do the same thing, I want to set this is spinning is set to false. All right. So now I have my conditions set up. So let's go ahead and save this and test this out. So I'm going to pull my scene here. All right, so now you'll see that it's just looping in this idle state, waiting for us to tell it when to transition to the next state, right? So now I can go ahead and just hit this checkbox, right? Because right now is spinning is false. So right now I can hit is spinning is true, and it'll transition to my spinning state. Now it's just going to hang out and wait there, right? Because now this condition right here, this is waiting for is spinning to be false. So this is going to infinitely spin and wait here until we tell it to turn off. So you'll see there too that it was taking a second for it to actually finish. I think a best way we can actually prevent that from happening is we can have this exit time. We can turn off this exit time. So now let's test this. So there you'll see that when we turn off that has exit time, it's not going to wait until the animation is finished. So with that turned on, it's going to wait till the animation is completely finished and then transition to that other state. But with this, when you turn it off like that, it could be, as soon as the spinning item animation starts, it'll quickly transition back. So you don't have to, there's not that delay. It looks a little funny, like you can see that little hiccup, but that's better than the user waiting, like pressing E on the keyboard, waiting for input, and then it takes them 1.5 or 2 seconds to actually see what they're affecting change in the world. So that has exit time you can play with, but that's the best way to get something to immediately transition from one state to the next. All right. And that about does it for the second. All right, so this one, I'm just going to change this to match what the instructions say. This is toggle spin. Just trying to keep it consistent for everybody. All right. And that about does it for the second experiment. So that's setting up your animation clips, right? You created animation clips, setting up the curves, putting in your keyframes. Now he's setting up the states themselves and the transitions, and also with the transitions, the conditions. I really wish they would have chose different words than transition and condition, because it makes it really hard to say.
Yeah.
Question?
For conditions, like how do you just delete them if you put like a wrong one?
Okay, so how do you delete a transition or a condition? So here you'll see this little equals sign. You can select that, and then you can hit the minus right there. So now that we've got that all set up, so I'm going to go ahead and save again, save the project. Now I'm going to come back over to Perforce, everybody's favorite. And now I've changed my scene, so I'm just going to go ahead and reconcile that. So it found change to my scene. And now also I've added some new files. So let's go ahead and take a look at the, let's see, wind turbine experiment. Let's go ahead and reconcile that folder. So there we go. It found some new files in there, right? It found the idle animation and the meta file. Found the spinning animation, and then also the controller, right? So this is a really good example of we're doing stuff in Unity, and you have to be conscious of what it is you're actually adding, or what it is you're actually changing. So alrighty, any questions at all from you guys about the second experiment? Any questions at all from the people online? No? Straightforward so far? So so here with our wind turbine, we just have these two states. Anyone want to take a guess on how many states a door would have? Standard entryway? 3. What would they be?
Idle, open, close.
So I just idle, open, like opening and closing.
Yeah. Just two.
Why do you think two?
Would it just be like that? Or I mean, idle.
An idle for each of the open and close screens.
Yep, exactly, right? So you have an idle closed, an opening, you have an idle open, right? It's just the door's just hanging out open, and then you have your closing state. So it'll definitely look a lot like this, to where here's your idle open, here's your idle close, here's your idle open, and then in between here you're going to have these other states like this that are going to pass through here and go like this. You'll end up with this diamond shape. That's just a little hint for your entryway. All right. So on to the last experiment, which is definitely a fun one. Talk a little bit about scripting, a little bit about setting up the audio, and really what we want to accomplish now, really the purpose of why we're writing the script, and definitely something you want to just ask yourself when you're going to write a script. What is it that I want this to actually do? All we need to do is, when the player presses E, hit this checkbox, right? We want to communicate with this animator, with this toggle spin, to turn this on and off, because we've already seen that when this is the control, this is how we transition from one state to the other. So now if we can control this through script, we can have interaction for the player. So now what we can go ahead and do is let's take our wind turbine. Let's go ahead and place it on our little podium here. All right, and now what we're going to need to do is have a little control station, a little area that we know that players can walk up to this, and this is like the interaction point. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a level blocking cube. Here's my little control station. Let's just name it. All right, and now on this object, we're going to create an empty game object inside this one. All right, we're going to name this control trigger. This is going to be the trigger volume for our player. So now in the inspector, I'm going to add a component to this. Let's add a sphere collider. All right, so on the collider component, right, you have this, you have some options, right? So here's this edit collider button. If you go ahead and hit that, you'll notice these little squares that pop up on the corners of the sphere, right? So I can grab them, and all this is doing is making my radius bigger or smaller. So it's the same thing as if scaling up like this, but this becomes a lot more versatile if you're making like a cube or like a box collider, or you just want to like scale it in one direction. But that's just one way to adjust your collider. Here, the center, this is actually where the collider is on the on the game object itself. So I can go ahead and move this in the X and position it where I want it to. All right, and now you'll also notice this is trigger checkbox. This is really useful because there's a function in Unity called onTriggerEnter. So there's two different types. There's onCollisionEnter and onTriggerEnter. They're definitely used for two separate uses. Like, if a bullet colliding with a player, or like, something colliding with like a boss, something like that. That's like onCollisionEnter. But like, you walk in any game you play where you walk up to something and a message comes up on screen, or you walk up to something and the door shuts behind you. That's all onTriggerEnter, right? Or when the player enters this volume, do something. So we're going to go ahead and turn that on, and we're going to utilize that. Here we have an option for a material. This is not like a normal material that you're used to. This is more of a physics material. So this will give this collider actual behavior. And we're going to talk more about this in week 4. Alrighty, so now we have the spot where the player is going to interact. So next thing we need to do is actually set up that functionality and make sure that we can interact properly. So I'm going to add a new script. Let's call this control turbine. I'm just going to call it control turbine may, because I may have another one in there. All right, I'll just go ahead and open this up. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit about some just basic stuff about your script so you understand it. The name of your class, right? So here, right here, you see the name of your class, and there's also the name of your script. These have to match. You always make sure that your class and the name of your script is matching. Otherwise, it's going to break. So the start and the update function. Anybody know what these are used for? No one? All right. So the start function, this is going to happen once.
What were you asking?
Do you know what the start and the update function do?
Yes, start is called once exactly when the script is called. A wake happens on the instance of the script.
Yep.
Update happens every frame of the script.
Yep, an update happens once per frame. So this is going to be running constantly. So what we need to do, in this script is we need to gain access to that animator, right? That animator on this game object. So that's the goal in the back of our head, right? So let's find it right here, this pivot object, right? So here's our pivot object, and here's this animator. We want to get access to this in our script. So there's a few things that we're going to need. And you'll see in the assignment itself, we've written out the script and then taken a screenshot of it. So you can't just copy and paste it. You need to actually write it yourself. But when I go through it, I'm going to do my best to actually explain, why it is we're doing certain things. So like I said before, you're not just regurgitating and writing this line by line. You're actually understanding the techniques, and so you can apply it later on. So the first thing what we're going to need is we need to find that game object, right? We need to find that turbine pivot game object. So I'm just going to create a public game object. And are you guys familiar with the difference between private and public? Yeah? All right, cool. So you know that, public, you'll be able to access that from other scripts or inside Unity. Private, you only can access it in this script.
Wouldn't you just use internal all the time instead of public though?
What?
Wouldn't you just use internal all the time instead of public though? So you like fake publicity?
Yeah, like a serialized field?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can use that. That's definitely stuff you get to into the programming foundations. You'll start to learn about serialized field and ranges and all stuff like that. Question?
Does it matter if we're on monodevelop?
No. No, you can be on monodevelop or Visual Studios. If you are on Visual Studios, real quick, one thing that will make it super easy if you're an online student or if one of you guys to have someone look at your code and decipher what's going on, go to Tools, Options, and then let's see, I think it's Language, Text Editor, All Languages, Line Numbers. So turn on your line numbers because by default they're not on, which is real weird to me. But turn them on, and that way if someone's looking at your script and be like, no, there's something, you're missing a semicolon on line 15. Or, it makes it a lot easier to read your code if you have your line numbers turned on. So make sure those are on. So here we have our public game object, right? And I just call this turbine pivot. I could really call this anything. It could be called pineapple, banana, anything. It doesn't matter as long as it's consistent throughout our script. So to show you that that's there, I'm going to go ahead and save my script and go to Unity. And now select my trigger object, control trigger. And now you'll see it's looking for that game object, right? It found this, the script is updated, and now it found that. Another thing to point out while I'm here, it's just a minor little tangent. When I created a new script, the way I did it, when I just did add component, new script, what Unity does is it just takes that and it throws it in my assets folder. It's like, I made it. Aren't you proud of me? I did it. But it didn't put it where we want it. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag this into my wind turbine experiments folder. That way, again, when I go back to Perforce, everything's in one easy place for me to upload at one time. It's probably, your script is probably just in your assets folder. So select the assets and it'll probably be down there hanging out. And this line comes up a lot. You'll see this going all the time when you go back and forth. You can hit ignored, but really what's going on is Unity is trying to serve multiple masters, and it doesn't know what to do with, like, you'll get this, this, and then also the line endings. Just go ahead and hit reload. Oh, don't want those. All right, so there we've got our public game object there that we can add to that once we have more stuff going on. All right. All right, now the next thing we need is the animator, right? So we have our game object. Now we need to create an animator to assign, and then we can get access from there. So this is going to be a private one because we don't necessarily want to have access to this somewhere else. So let's just create a private animator. Let's call this pivot anim, right? So this is going to be the animation component of this game object. Right now we're just creating references to things so we can gain access to them in Unity and tell them what it is we want to do. And now also in Unity we have our toggle spin Boolean, right? This parameter. So what we need to do is also create a Boolean in our script, and we can set those equal to each other. So if the one in our script is false, that one is false. If the one in the script is true, this one is true. So let's go ahead and create a private bool. Let's call this is spinning. Alrighty. So the first thing we need to do is in our start function, as soon as the level loads, we want to get access to this toggle spin Boolean, right? We want to find this toggle spin. So a way to do this, we want to find it and then also set it equal to our Boolean, right? So make them the same. So on start, we're going to say is spinning equals turbine pivot, right? So it's this game object dot get component, right? And you need those angle brackets like that. And then we're going to get access to the, sorry, I'm doing this backwards. On start, we need to get access to the animator. So the pivot anim, turbine pivot, get component animator. Sorry about that. We're going to be doing the other functionality somewhere else. Let me just make sure my naming is right. All right, so the first thing we're doing when the level loads is we're going to say this private animator that we have in our script, this animator is equal to the component of this turbine pivot. So let's go ahead, before we get too far, let's go ahead and add in our object to our script here. So here it's looking for our turbine pivot, right? Here we need to actually add our game object, right? That's our pivot object that has our animator on it. So let's go ahead and drop that in there. Alrighty. So then, this is going to happen on start. So as soon as the level loads, this animator is equal to this game object's animator, right? And we only need to do that once. But on update, in the update function, we're going to need to explain to Unity that we want our Booleans to be equal all the time, right? They're going to change them, but we always want to make sure they're equal. So we're going to put this in our update function. So what we're going to do is just say is spinning, which is our Boolean up here, and this equals our pivot anim dot get bool, right? We're just going to get the Boolean. And now if you'll notice, if you hover over this, it says parentheses string name, right? So we need to say what the Boolean is that we want to get, right? So in our parentheses there, put our quotes, And then we're just going to write in the name of our Boolean, which we put in toggle spin, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check. Naming is really important too. So lowercase t, capital S. All right, that looks good. So now on update, those are going to be set equal to each other. Everyone still doing okay? All right, cool. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the functionality of onTriggerEnter. So there's a few different ones. So there's onTriggerEnter, onTriggerStay, and onTriggerExit. So let me just pull this up, and this is derived off of the Collider class, but definitely super useful. And definitely here's the documentation. If you want to dig into it, this will be really useful. But can anyone tell me the difference between onTriggerEnter, onTriggerStay, and onTriggerExit? Okay. Okay. Exactly. The very, very good answer. It's really straightforward on what the names are, right? onTriggerEnter happens when you enter the trigger. Anybody know how many times that can happen? Once. Yes, exactly, right? It's onTriggerEnter is only ever going to be called one time. So this is a great reason why we don't want to have our player presses E on onTriggerEnter, because that means we have to press E the frame that the player enters, which is nearly impossible for the human eye to actually understand. So that's why, like, your onTriggerEnter, you'll have different things, different type of events in there. And then your onTriggerStay is where you want a lot of your functionality, because onTriggerStay is going to be getting called over and over again, almost like the update frame, or like the update function. It's going to be getting called over and over again as long as the player is in the volume. But onTriggerEnter and exit only happens one time. So now I'm just going to go ahead, and this is a function, so we need parentheses. And now this is asking for a collider. So I'm just going to go ahead and write collider. And now the name that comes after this, again, it doesn't matter what you choose. In here, you see we've named it as entity. This is just to refer to the object itself, whatever that object is that's colliding. Some people like to use other. Some people. What? Game object. Collider go. Okay. So yeah, we can really go with anything. So why not? As long as you understand it, you really want to make it something that's easy to read. But this just goes to show you that this is just a name, and we just want to keep our naming consistent. So our onTriggerEnter here, let's just go ahead and put in some functionality, right? So when we're in here, we want to be checking for the player, right? So one way we can do this is we could find the player's name. We could find that object in the world and check for that. But Unity has given us this really nice functionality with these tags here. We can find objects based on a certain tag. So not everything is going to trigger this, only something with a certain tag. So they've also given us something really nice. Let me go ahead and drop in my hub level. So you'll notice that on our character, we have a tag. Whoop, where is it? It's been tagged as player, right? So we can tell our script that only trigger this if statement or only run this functionality if the object that collided, this go here, is tagged as player. So to do that, we're just going to write an if statement. So if go dot tag, right? Because this go is just referring to whatever this is. Doesn't matter what the name is. And then we're going to do double equals, and then do player. So can anybody tell me why down here this is double equals, and everyone else over here that there's single equals?
Double equals means equals means equals.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, but a really good way to discern that with what you said there is double equals is for a comparison, single equals is for an assignment. So I'm telling Unity in the start and the update, I'm saying this pivot anim, this is equal to this other object. This Boolean, this equals this other Boolean. Here I'm saying check and see if this is equal to this. This is just a comparison. Question?
Get pulled, that's just a property for the animator, right? Is that just for the animator? Or can you use that property?
No, you can use that for other things. So yeah, so comparison versus assignment. Understanding the two differences between those. I know when I was first getting into scripting, it was a little bit confusing for me at first, but now I really got a handle on when you want to use one over the other. So now in our onTrigger enter, if our game object is tagged as player, we just want to have some functionality in here. So for now, let's just write a print just to make sure that this is actually working. You can also use a debug.log if you prefer those. So let's just write the player has entered the control trigger, just so we know it's working. All right, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this a few times. I'm going to change this to onTrigger stay, and I'm going to change this to onTrigger exit. And the player is in the control trigger, and now here the player has left. So this is just going to showcase that this is working. I always want to do, it's always best to do smaller chunks of scripting or smaller chunks of code and test it out rather than write this entire script and now go into Unity and play, but you have 4 or 5 errors. So do this in small chunks. Don't try and just write the whole thing, and really come back and do some testing. So now I should have, I've got my 2 scenes in there, right? I've got my hub level and I got my wind turbine scene. I'm going to go ahead and move the character because I've been doing a little bit of testing with him. Is it scene? Okay, so now we want to make sure, now it's definitely important that we double check and make sure our trigger volume is set to trigger, right? So have this on is trigger. So I go ahead and play now. Get my console in a spot you can see it. So let's come up to this. All right, so now if you, let's see if I can remember this. If I hit collapse here, so you'll see that this is just going to keep spamming over and over again. If you hit collapse, it's going to compress it, and you'll see a number next to it for how many times it's happened. So now you'll see when I enter, right, my player has entered, that's 2, and now it's continually ticking up as long as I'm staying in it. And now when I leave, the player has left the trigger, now that's set to 2. So now I understand that my trigger volume is working, and those if statements are functioning. Right, it's really good to get to that point where you know that this is working, you know this print line is happening, because now we can add in more functionality in there now that our logic is set up properly. So, like I said, most of the stuff we're going to be doing is in our onTrigger stay. So this is where we're going to be checking for our player input. So what we can do is we can put another if statement inside of here, right? So onTrigger stay, if the object is the player, run this other function or check for something else. So now what we can do is inside of here, we're going to put another if statement. And now this is where we're going to actually put in our input, right? Or check for the input. So input dot. So if you always put that, if you put the period in Visual Studios, I think it's also in MonoDevelop, you get that dot operator. This will show you everything you could possibly put after this input command. So we're going to do a get key. So anybody, this is another pretty self-explanatory question, but anybody know the difference between get key down, and get key up? Josh?
Get key returns true for while the player is holding down the key. Get
Yep.
key down returns true just the frame the key is pressed. Get key up is the frame
it's released, right? So all those could be used for different scenarios. So like player input is most often just get key. So as long as the player is holding W, continue to move forward. You could have different scenarios do different things. Like you want the player to hold a button for a certain time and let go at a timing element. That would be get key up. So all these can be used for different scenarios. So let's go ahead and do a get key up. All right, and then again we can, this is a function, so we need parentheses. And now in the parentheses we can say what key that we want the player to press, right? So this is key code. And now again I hit the dot operator, and now this will show me basically every single button on my keyboard. Here's your joystick. This could be used for either a regular joystick or also a game controller. You have your access to your mouse. But we're just going to go over for now the standard interact button on PC, which is the E key. So if the player presses E, and now here we also want to check for our excuse me, our Boolean that we've set up here, right? So if the player presses E, and so right, we can use this double ampersand here. So this will check for two conditions, right? So if they press E and is spinning is set to false, we want to go ahead and run another function. So we can actually get rid of, make sure I'm definitely a stickler about trying to get all my brackets on the same line. This makes it much easier for me to understand everything. There we go. So if they press E and is spinning is false, what do we want to do? Anybody know what the next line is? I'm going to delete this for now. We don't need this anymore.
You want to set it to true, right?
Yeah, I want to set what to true. Not quite. You're close, because up here is spinning is equal to this other Boolean. So if we change this Boolean, is spinning is also going to change. Right? We want to change the actual oh boy. Is it pivot? Yeah, we want to change this one itself, right? Because toggle spin is that equal to is spinning. So what we can do is in here, we're just going to write pivot anim. So up here we get the bool. There's another function that is set bool. So here, come on, there it is, capital S. So set bool there. So if I hover over this, same thing as before. I always like to use this too, especially if there's a function I'm not too familiar with, or I've used once or twice but not super familiar with. If you hover over it, you'll see in the parentheses what it's looking for, right? So set bool is looking for a string name and also a bool value, right? So it needs to know the name of what it is we need to change and what we want to change it to, right? So this is, again, we want to change toggle spin. All right, and then we want to change toggle spin to true. All right. And now let's just go ahead and put in our print actually and just write the player has activated typing. All right, so let's go ahead and test that out and see what happens, see if I broke anything. So this one, definitely when you see warnings in Unity, go ahead and stop, especially errors as well. Definitely don't just keep going. But this one is the one that you're not necessarily responsible for. you're not ever going to be at fault for this one. So this is, again, as was mentioned, that Unity is trying to serve multiple masters. It's trying to serve MonoDevelop, trying to serve Visual Studios, it's trying to be on Mac, trying to be on PC, a lot of different things. So basically this is just complaining because whether if you're on Mac or Windows or even Linux, the lined endings are different. They're inconsistent. So this will just keep coming up, but you can ignore this one. But more often than not, always make sure and check that you don't have big errors and warnings piling up. So now, if I come over here and let me show you my animator window as I do this. So you'll see I'm in that idle state. I go ahead and enter. So now if I press E, now it's transitioned to that spinning state, right? Because my Boolean is now set to true. Question?
Yeah, can you show me in your void start how you're doing the or how you're setting the private animator to get the animator component?
Sure. So in the start function, we just have this pivot anim, right? This private animator here, and that equals our turbine pivot, which is this other game object, dot get component. And here in the square brackets, you say the name of what is that component you want to find. Alrighty, so now we can turn the wind turbine on, but we can't yet turn it off. But don't worry, the work is already done. Does anybody know what we need to do now to get this functionality in place to have it also turn off?
Could you,
else pivot and set will promise to default.
You could do an else if. We can just write another if statement though for now. Do the same thing. So we can just copy this, right? And it's the same thing inside of our onTrigger stay. We have this if gameObject.tag is player, and they press E and it's false, turn it to true. Now down here we just need to switch it out, right? So if it's true, change it to false. Because again, all of our animation, everything is driven on this Boolean here. So let me save. All right, so now press E, turns on. Nice little spinning animation. And to press E again, and it turns off. All right, and now I should be able to sit here all day and just turn it on and off as much as I want. Alrighty. Looks good there. So in the instructions itself, you'll notice I actually want to change these. There's just so much to do, not enough time. In the instructions, this image is all the way at the bottom down here. But if you're watching the video, or if you guys are going to do this later on, I recommend going and adding this stuff in earlier. Don't just follow along, do every single line of code in here, and now get down and add it in and something breaks. So really just test it out, make sure everything is working as is, and then go from there. So the next thing we want to do is add in some audio. This is just another way to give us some player feedback and some interaction. So you'll notice on Perforce, in this entryway folder, there is a turbine_audio.package. So this will have just 2 audio clips for you. And since I'm here, I'll also mention, because this is a great resource to use for your entryway and the rest of your project. I get questions about this website all the time. So weststarmusic.sourceaudio.com. You go to this website. As a Full Sail student, you have full access to this. So you go ahead and hit login. Don't buy anything. If you go and hit login, the login, and this is in the assignment itself, but if you want to write this down, it's library@fullsail.com. That's the email address you use. And the password, super original, fullsail1234. That's the password to log in. So you can go ahead and log in. And they've got a really, really cool selection of sound effects and music. So they have music, but then if you just go to the sound effects tab over here, 233,000 audio clips, right? If I just do like door opening, right, here's all these different door sound effects opening. So I can hit play. So you can preview all these sound effects, and then you can hit this little download button to download them, and then bring them into Unity. And then I'm going to show you right now how to actually get them to play when you want them to. But definitely use this website. You know, you've got all kinds of sound effects. Just search for what it is you're looking for. I bet you there's something there. But also, you know, you got a microphone on your computer. You can also record your own sound effects. I've seen that done pretty successfully in the past. So now I'm going to go ahead and I think I have it in my project already, but I'm just going to go ahead and import it anyways. So I'm going to go and import a package, import custom package. And now you navigate to your folder or to your workspace, IND content, entryway, turbine audio. So this will open up, oh, and I already have them in here. So let me delete these so you can see them being imported. Import package, turbine audio, and there we go. So this package just has these two sound effects, and it's already being put into the wind turbine experiment folder. I had done so. If you named your something differently, just go ahead and move all your assets into this folder. So we have this click in this wind loop sound effect, right? So when we click and interact with the console, we want there to be some feedback to the player that they actually did interact, right? And now this wind loop, this is just going to act as something to give the player some ambient noise to let them know that this is turned on and it is active. Alrighty, so the first thing we want to do is on our control trigger itself, we need to actually include an audio source. So select the control trigger, and if you do have both of your scenes open, definitely make sure that you're setting your active one. If you're adding anything new, make sure it's going into the correct scene. So with our control trigger selected, I'm going to go ahead and add an audio source. All right, audio source. All right, so now in here, it's looking for an audio clip, right? So what clip is it do you want me to play? So if you hit this little circle over here with the dot, it's going to open up this little window, and this will show you everything in your project, all the sound effects you have. So I'm going to select the click sound effect. And now you'll see this play on awake checkbox. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory, or should be, that this is going to play as soon as the level starts. So a really good way to test that your audio is actually working and that your sound file is not corrupted or anything weird is just play Unity, and you should hear it with that play on awake. Right? Hear that sound effect? That we know the sound is playing, it's working. Now we want to play at certain times. So this loop, obviously, that will cause it to loop. You can really hit this little book here, and this will open up, basically explain everything you need to know about all the intricacies of the audio source if you really want to get into this more and customize it or do what you'd like. And you also have the option of some 3D sounds, right? So you can set up some volumes and some audio sources based on if this player is in this volume or if they're this close, you can hear the sound effect. So a really cool feature that used to be much harder, but they've made it very, very nice for users now. So let's go ahead and turn off this play on awake. And we can turn up the minimum distance just a little bit so the player can hear it from farther out. And then feel free to mess with this. Really the best way to understand how this is working is just break it, try it, see what happens when you mess with stuff, and really just have fun with it and see what you can produce. So we have our audio source on the control trigger itself. So let's go to our script and actually add in the functionality to play this sound effect. So what we're going to need in here is just like we have for our animator, right? We are assigning this private animator to something. we want to do the same thing with our audio source. So I'm going to create a private audio source. And anyone have a name for me? Bob? All right, I'm going to do click Bob so we know what Bob is playing. Right? So again, it doesn't matter what our name is as long as it's consistent. You do want to name it something specific, but I'm just using goofy names to get the point across that it doesn't matter what it's named as long as it's consistent. Exactly. So now what we want to do is in our start function, same thing as we did is find this component and set them equal to each other. We want to do that as well. So I'm going to say click Bob equals. So one key difference to notice here is object-oriented programming. We're setting this up in a way to where everything we want to control and affect is all contained in this game object. So you'll see here, before we did pivot anim equals turbine pivot.getComponent. The reason that we're doing that is because this component, this animator, is not on the same game object, right? So if we select our control station here, or our control trigger, we don't have that animator on here, so we need to reference it from another game object. But if this audio source is now on the same game object, we don't need to say this. So normally you could say game object dot get component. That's the wrong game object, lowercase. Game object dot get component audio source, right? Because we're finding an audio source. That's a function. So you could write that, right? So GameObject.getComponent. But all this is doing is it knows that this is on the same game object, so we don't need this. Same thing here as we did turbine pivot. This is specifying on that turbine pivot game object. But because this audio source is on the same game object as the script, we can just write getComponent audio source because it knows exactly what it is it's looking for, where it's looking for that. Make sense? Cool. So then from there, now that we have access to that, all we need to do is have this play at a certain time, right? So pretty straightforward. All we want to do is come in here and just write click Bob. That's the name of our audio source. And then do dot. And then if we do dot, we can see all the different things that we have access to. There's stop, unpause, and then here there is play. Right? You could do play delayed, that would be dead, play one shot. That means it's only going to play one time and not again. So we're just going to do clickbob.play. All right. And now I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it in my other one. So now when I turn it on, you hear the click. When you turn it off, you hear the click. All right, let's come to Unity. Let's save it. Why not? Better to be too paranoid than not. Alrighty, so there we go. It turns on. Moving for a while, to press E again, and it turns off. Right, there's the two sound effects there playing when I want them to. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? So we're going to do it one more time. Similar setup, slightly different, but not too far off. We're going to add that wind sound effect. So when you're setting up your audio sources, you always want to think, and this is why the 3D stuff is so nice, is you want to think, where is the sound effect coming from? If you're having, the player turns on a generator, and when it turns on, there's a motor starts churning, and you hear all these noises. You don't want to put that sound effect on the player or on a tree or somewhere on your building. You put that sound effect on your actual generator, on the object that's actually making the noise. So on our pivot object, I'm going to go ahead and add another audio source. All right, and then here I'm plugging my clip and do the wind loop. All right, and now for this one, again, we can test it and make sure it's working. So play on awake. Hear that just humming or whirling wind noise. So we know it's playing. So now we're going to turn that off, and we want this one to loop. So we're going to check on the loop. So that means, once it gets to the end, it's going to start at the beginning and go over and over again. So now we just want to go back to our script and then add in this functionality again, right? So same thing, we do another audio source. So we're going to do private audio source. Let's just call this wind loop, wind audio. All right, and then same thing, right? So since our audio source we're getting is on another object, we're going to need to explain to the script what that object is. So again, it's on our turbine pivot object. We didn't create anything new. Now we can just change this here to say wind audio equals, so that audio source equals the audio source on our turbine pivot object. All right. So then, same thing, come down to here, and we can write wind audio dot play. All right. And now same thing here, except we don't want to continue to play it here. We want it to turn off at this point, right? So it's going to be on, and then when we turn it off, we want the wind noise to stop. So we're just going to use the stop functionality or stop function. All right, let's go ahead and save that. Save our scene, test it out. All right, come up to it. Hear the click sound effect. You hear that wind going for as long as I keep it on. Press E again, and it turns off, and the wind audio stops. So that is the whole functionality, everything you need to understand for the entryway. So we went over complex game objects. We covered the animation and the animator window. And then there at the end, we talked about setting up the trigger volume and getting that parameter that we set up in the animator to be controlled when we want it to. So again, I'm just going to come back to Perforce and submit my work one last time. Assets. Scene. So I know that again, I changed my scene, so I'm going to reconcile here. And then I also made some changes to the experiment folder. Right, so it saw that I made a change, I modified my controller, and then I added my script. Right, definitely always don't just hit reconcile, like you don't just reconcile offline work and then hit the reconcile button. Actually look at what files you're being modified and changed. That'll really make sure you understand what it is that you're checking out. And if you feel like you don't want to be using that, if you want to just come to this wind turbine experiment folder and check out the whole thing while you're working, I encourage you to do that. I really want people to use reconcile offline work when they understand what it's doing. So really, if you can wrap your head around that, it's checking out modified files, adding new ones and deleting ones that aren't there, you'll have control over it. But don't just get in this habit of using reconcile and offline work because I'm telling you to. I want you to really understand what it's doing. And it really comes with practice. Once you get your hands dirty and utilize Unity and Perforce, you'll start to understand, you'll run into some issues, you'll solve some of the problems you're having. So I showed a few of you I showed you guys that skull last time. Let me pull it up. If you want to, I'm going to put this up in lab today, and I'll send out announcements to all the online students. So if you guys want to actually play this yourself. But you'll notice in his here compiled. So in this one, he did a little bit more, obviously, than what is required. But you'll notice this this trigger here. So when I come up to this, right, there's a trigger volume there that now when it's open, if I walk up to this, it's going to hit that trigger and it's going to cause different functionality, right? So it's going. That's a trigger. So when I mentioned it a little bit, that is trigger. That's how you can, or sorry, that different parameter. That's how you can jump to one state at a certain time and then go back. So really useful stuff, and definitely try it out too, because the entryway can be done with just a trigger volume, or just with triggers and not with the Boolean if you'd like. You can use this trigger here. So really, there's not much difference. So say here, instead of this condition, my script isn't going to work quite right. Let's see, will this break? If I remove this and add a new condition, it might break. Oh, all right, cool. So here's my condition, right? Now you'll notice with this, if I just hit this trigger, on this little plus sign down here, like how do you add new parameters? You add the parameters right here, and then you select your transition you want, right? And then you can. So I'm gonna make both of these a trigger. So these are both on trigger, right? And I'm not setting them to anything. So now if I go and hit play, so my interaction, I'd have to go back into the script and change it to basically, instead of set bool, you just do set trigger. It's that simple. So now you'll see when I hit this, it triggers, and now it's on. You notice this isn't like staying on or anything. This is just, it was selected and then it's off. So this is just like trigger, cause this to happen. So that's another good way to utilize that. Definitely test that out. So you'll notice I have one example that I'll show you of my own. It's not completed yet. I'm still working on it. I definitely wish it was, yeah. And it's definitely, I've got a lot of my own work to do. I don't have my own time to do stuff like this, but I like doing it a lot, and I try and find time for it. So I got my entryway in here. Back to default now. So one thing this does show is you can do a lot more with what we just learned. You can set up really cool animations, intricate systems. Another thing that this is going to show, delete my walls. I'm going to hide my walls so you can see the whole thing. Another thing this is going to show is how you can actually turn what we just learned into an actual mechanic. So two little pieces to note here. So another thing I'm definitely really tried to do for this example was don't use anything but level blocking meshes. So everything you see here I've built with level blocking meshes, and I've done that for a reason. So here I'm showing off a trigger to where I can't interact with this. I can't open this up yet because it's locked. But now you'll see that there's these switches over here. And I want to have a little sign to tell you the order that they go in. But now it's basically I can walk up to these and press E and interact, right? Same thing we just learned, just play an animation. But I have it set up to where each one of these is tied to a Boolean, right? So when this order is set up properly, when I have them in the right order, right? So right now I can mess with all of them. But it's in the right order, that case opens up, and now I'm able to interact with this. Right? So now I have, this is almost like my unlocked functionality. So I can come up to this and press E, and the lighting is real bad, so it's hard to see, but like I have some of these gears spinning. Obviously it's not completed yet, but the door opens, and I can go through to the other side. Yep, and then I can cause it to close over there. So that's one way that you can, turn this into an actual mechanic, right? So that's one way you can have these little levers and puzzle set up where it's basically just booleans, right? Like if this boolean's true, this one's false, and this one's true, unlock the door, things like that. So that'll give you a lot more, and hopefully inspire you to think outside from just like a regular doorway. Really try and come up with something, a bit more creative. And just if you have a tough time doing that, start with the doorway or start with a regular entryway. Then if you have that completed, then kind of explore from there. But definitely don't try and overscope yourself to where now you have so much to do and so much to animate. Really start simple and only work your way up if you think that you've got a really strong grasp on everything. That's about it. I don't know why it was so dark in there. Oh. The parameters? Sure. Oh, there we go. So I'll go back to the parameters. The other thing too to point out, and you'll see that there is a frame as one of the requirements. This is something I'm really like shooting for. Something like this that you could take this as a prefab and drop in. You could put walls around this, like I'm doing. Like I have these wall pieces that I did just to show how it would look in a level for these wall pieces like this. So really build some type of frame that you can create a prefab out of, and then drop in your level somewhere. You don't want to just build this into a wall and that's a custom spot. Really have it to where this could be dropped in somewhere else. And yeah, everything here I did with level blocking meshes. So this would definitely show you that you can really get down to some nitty gritty and do some cool stuff with just these simple shapes. It's just how much effort and how much detail you're going to put in. Like this console was, just a cube with a back cube there, and then that little wedge shape. But it's just how you put it together, and messing around with it that's going to give you these results. So you said back to the uh, parameters. Let me see that in. Enter line pivot. The conditions. This should be your toggle spin true. The test trigger is not. The test trigger is an actual trigger. Toggle spin is a bool, yeah. How do you tell the difference? Well, you'll notice, how can you tell the difference between a trigger and a boolean? So if you select one, you'll see a trigger doesn't even give you an option to set it to something. You just have trigger. It's just trigger this thing to happen. And now, the parameter or the boolean has this true or false value. Also, you'll notice in the parameter list, the trigger is a circle dot and the toggle spin is a square checkbox. So I guess real quick, I forgot a little bit of time. I can show you an animation event real quick. So if we have this pivot object here, and I say I want to add a new script. I want to add, say, animation events. New script. All right, so let's doing that. So in my in this script I just created, if I just create a new function, let's just call this public void animation test. And it's a function. Now in here I just write print hooray animation events. Alright, so now I have my function there. All it's doing is that print line. So now I come over to my animation. So say I go to window animation. Now in my idle, say I want to add, halfway through I want it to print that. Add my event there. I do edit animation event, and now I have that animation test that I just created, right? That function I just had. So this is how I was doing the. Actually, I could show you in my entryway. That's one way I was actually changing the color of my button. I changed my button from red to green. That was on an animation event. At a certain point in the animation, change the material from red to green. So now you'll see when I play. Let me set this up right. Oh, close this. Maximize. So now you'll see in my console, this is constantly being called because my animation right now is looping. Every time it goes through this animation, every time it goes through the animation, when it hits that point, it's causing this event to happen. So useful stuff when you do your entryway, you could basically just have it, rather than doing the setting up the private audio source, setting them equal to each other, things like that, you can just have it play a sound effect in your opening or in your closing animation, whichever you may want. So really useful stuff. You'll use it a little bit more in level design, and you'll probably need to use stuff like this for your level itself. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of introduction to it and know that it's out there, and that's just real quick and easy to get to in your animation window, right? You just add that little tick right there. All right, so any last questions?
Can you go back to the script?
The script? Sure. Not that one. Which part of it?
The if statements on the operator.